They all began with something small. A noise, a shadow, a detail that didn't belong. One tiny thing grew into a pattern, and the pattern became proof that I was not alone. By the end of each night, my sense of safety had been rearranged. These are 3 true stories that did that to me. 3 nights split between snow, a crowded city, and the place I thought was safest, my own home. I'm not dramatizing. I tell these things the way they happened to me. I'm the one who lived through them. I'm the one who kept replaying them in my head for months afterward. Quick sponsor note. Thanks to the folks who help keep this channel going. Now, stay with me. The first one starts in a forest with a dog named Rosco and a snow so quiet it felt alive. I went up into the state forest because I needed space. Not the weekend crowd or the monotony of the city, but that cold, clean kind of isolation where you can breathe and be small. Rosco came with me. He was a large mutt with muddy paws and a bark that could split a quiet into pieces. We camped in a clearing that sat like a bowl in the trees, a place where the snow swallowed sound. Even his breathing sounded different out there, deeper, somehow more human. I'd set the tent, stacked a small fire, and settled in with coffee and a cheap paperback. The sky went down to a hard black. The fire made a private light. It was late. I don't remember the exact hour until later, but it was that liminal time when the world is mostly asleep and the mind starts to feel larger than the space it's in. Roscoe's ears perked first, one low warning, a rustle in him that I had learned to read. He rose, sniffed the air, then barked, twice, sharp and awake. I looked toward the tree line and saw a shape. Human, but leaning in the dark, a silhouette at the edge where the trees met the moonless field. He stood there like he'd arrived by not arriving. No path to him, no tracks leading from anywhere obvious. Just there. At first I told myself it was some hiker, a hunter, someone who'd misread the map. I didn't want to think worse. I called out, half casual, half protective, "You okay out there?" The figure didn't answer. He only shifted his weight, then stepped closer, a slow, deliberate cut into the open. Rosco went rigid beside me and let out a low growl. The man stopped at the line where the trees gave way, where the light from my fire barely reached. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He watched. The first encounter was small and manageable. I tightened my grip on the thermos. I remembered that I had my little handgun in the pack, licensed, and kept more for rattlers and bad luck than for people. I promised myself I would not let the night get bigger than it had to be. I forced a laugh, said something about the cold, and when he didn't move, I told myself he would leave. He left. He retreated into the trees the way someone steps off a curb. Rosco kept barking for a bit, then flopped back down and settled his head across my boots like an anchor. I slept in fits. When the tent's inner fabric moved, I would freeze and hold my breath until the sound passed. I told myself I was being dramatic. The forest is full of noises. People told me later that deer or an owl could explain anything, but nothing explained how human eyes sat at the tree line and didn't belong there. Sometime after midnight, after the fire had died to coals, I woke to the feeling that something was close. It's one of those instincts you can't explain until it's too late. Every hair along your arms and neck pulled sharp. The tent fabric pressed inward like a sigh. Rosco, who had been sleeping unnaturally still, lifted his head and stared at the zipper. He began to whine, low and steady. The sound pooled in my chest worse than any footsteps. I didn't want to open the tent. I told myself that opening it would be a performance, but Rosco wouldn't stop. I reached for the little flashlight and peeled back the flap just enough to see a pair of boots, not walking away, standing there. I could make out the hem of pants, the angle of a coat, close enough for me to smell cold air and something faintly chemical, like a scent you only ever notice when you are trying to name fear. I said a name I didn't expect to say aloud. Hey, what are you doing?" My voice surprised me. Thin, higher than usual, the figure shifted. He came closer until he was at the edge of the tent, just on the outside of the fabric. Rosco snarled and bared teeth. I grabbed the gun from my pack because I had always said I would if something happened. Holding it felt like a decision already made. There it was, a real weight in my hands, a consequence. I told him to leave. I told him in a voice that tried to be calm and had the wrong edges to it. He made no answering sound, but somehow his body language felt like attention, like someone who had been waiting for a reaction. Then, as suddenly as he'd come, he stepped back. Footsteps receded into the trees. I watched his silhouette until it disappeared into a place where shadows pooled thick and would let nothing out. I did not sleep afterward. Not really. Dawn came as a pale certainty, and the morning light made the dark things ridiculous and true at once. Footprints in the snow that started where there had never been footprints before, faint scuffs at the tree line as if someone had leaned their shoulder against a tree and listened. I packed fast and left, and I didn't go back. In the months after that night, small things changed in me. I heard branches in the city differently. When someone moved in a nearby building, my brain cataloged their steps by the hour. 10:12 p.m., 1:30 a.m., 3 hours a.m. I slept closer to the door, always facing the entry. I felt more tired, because my body had learned to keep some of its watch. If this has your heart racing, hit like and subscribe. I've got 2 more. The second story is the opposite of solitude. Crowds, festivals, a city that feels nothing like the woods, but carries the same kind of wrongness. It happened in Charleston, during July 4th weekend 2025, when the city was both packed and oddly empty in parts, tourists everywhere, but stillness tucked into alleys that seemed to swallow the bustle. I was with my friend Mark. We had planned a long day of walking, the kind of aimless itinerary that lets you find a coffee shop you weren't looking for, and a tiny courtyard full of strangers at noon. Markets hummed, vendors shouted, people moved in the ghosts of their celebrations. The day was humid and bright, the kind of heat that makes colors bleed into a slow wash. Everything in the city seemed to be doing its job of being a city. We saw him in a crowded market. He shouldn't have been there. The kind of thing was small at first. A man in a wedding suit, tailor-fitted, pristine like he'd just walked out of a boutique. The suit shocked the market's casualness. It wasn't the suit itself, but how he wore it, the way he held himself like an exhibit that hadn't been unwrapped. A perfect bow tie, shiny shoes, no bouquet, no other people. Mark nudged me. Weird, he said. Weird, then, was something to laugh about. The kind of strange you point at with a beer and forget. We left and he remained in the corners of our vision. We saw him again on a narrow street lined with old brick, where a tour guide's voice droned about ghosts and old scandals. The tour group clustered, and in that crowd our eyes slid to the suit man. He stood a few yards away, always in places that emphasized dissonance. Outside a bakery, by a fountain, in the frame of a doorway. Sometimes he was farther than the last place we'd seen him, across an improbable stretch. Sometimes he was closer. People passed near him and didn't notice anything other than his quiet presence. It was as if his being there was a secret that only a handful of people along our route had been led into. On a ghost tour night, the air was thick with stories, cheap lanterns, and the ocean's smell made every small sound seem charged. The guide told us something about a shipwreck. Laughter spread like sparkles, and there he was, on the opposite side of the lane, turning his head in a motion that looked too smooth for the crowd's frantic energy. He seemed to move on a different clock. Not fast. Not slow exactly, but deliberately out of step. In a crowd that jostled and pushed, he existed like an image pasted onto the scenery. We started to track where he appeared. If you told the pattern out, it made less sense each time. Market, alley, tour, crowd, doorway across the square. Places that were not connected by a path it made sense to take if you were as slow and precise as he was. We asked a vendor about him once. "Haven't seen him," she said, and went on wrapping something in paper. Nobody else seemed to register the same dislocation we did. That, more than anything, unsettled me. The silence around him. A week later, on our last night, we were back at the small apartment we'd rented. Rain had started, turning the city's lights into smeared strokes across the window. We lay on the couch, exhausted in that way you get after heavy walking and too much sugar. Mark fell asleep almost immediately, mouth open like a small man harmlessly surrendering to the dark, and I kept staring at the window because I couldn't let the city be ordinary inside my head. A movement snapped my attention, a figure crossing the street, turning a corner where the rain hid details in a grey sheet. For a moment, I couldn't place the line of his suit against the wet. Then the shape curved, and the bow tie caught the leftover light, a precise white point in a blur. He moved like a man on a loop, like someone replaying a moment until it fit some internal script. He had been everywhere and nowhere, public but invisible. That image has stayed with me. It sits between other memories like a photograph that refuses to be filed away. Mark and I were both quiet for a long time after that. We didn't talk about it much because there's no good way to talk about a sense that you can't share with the people around you. It wasn't just being watched. It was the knowledge that something which didn't belong in the fabric of normal life could anchor itself there and not be shaken off. Crowds had not protected us. The city had not shielded us. A man in a suit with a bow tie lingered in my mind long after we flew home. What happens when you imagine danger and it keeps showing up even where that image shouldn't be? For me, that was the most haunting part. The suit man never approached us. He never did anything overt. He simply existed in the wrong places at the wrong times, and that was enough to make me feel like the ground around me had subtly shifted. And then there was the thing that made me want the light on in my house forever. The night an intruder had been living in my basement without me knowing. My life had settled into routines. Work, coffee, the same route home. You get used to certain little consistencies. A charger that lives on the nightstand, a left shoe that always slides under the couch, the dull hum of the refrigerator. So when one of those small things shifted, I noticed. At first it was a charger unplugged on a morning when I'd definitely left it plugged in. A locked door with the bolt barely loose when I'd sworn I'd tightened it. A faint clump of mud on the tile I couldn't imagine bringing in. I told myself I was tired, and my memory had holes. That's what you tell yourself when you want to preserve the ordinary. The noises started later. Soft, almost polite taps. At first I blamed a neighbor. Then at night came the subtle sounds that aren't supposed to be in your house. The creak of a stair that had never been walked at midnight. The scrape of something being dragged. The rational mind arranges these into logical stacks. Mice, old pipes, the house settling. But the pile of small things kept growing. A mark on the doorframe. A faint, wiped footprint behind the washer. Too small to be a shoe, but too deliberate to be anything else. Mud where there should not have been mud. I called a locksmith and had locks replaced. The locksmith was polite and quick, and reminded me that changing locks was a good piece-for-money swap. He replaced the bolt, shook his head at the type of latch I had, and left. That night, the tapping at the door started again. It sounded different now, more like someone testing a barrier than a wind. I slept with the lamp on, but the lamp was a poor sentry. One night, I woke at 3:11 a.m. to a sensation that someone was in the house. There is an immediate clarity in that hour. Half the world is uncompromised by daylight excuses. My heart slammed. The house held its breath. I grabbed my phone and flicked the flashlight app on and moved quietly toward the basement door. From above I could hear, unmistakable this time, a slow exhale coming from below, like breath in a small cave. Someone was there. I moved down the last steps, and the beam caught a silhouette sitting on an old mattress against the far wall. He was barefoot, curled in like he was trying to make himself smaller to fit into a place that wasn't made for him. I froze. He didn't move at first. When he did, he raised his hands slightly, as if to say he meant no immediate harm. They brought him out in handcuffs. Police officers, some neighbors who had called, and the locksmith stood in the doorway like a chorus around the end of something. I watched them take him up the steps in the cold light and into a squad car. Later, they told me they'd found signs he'd been there for days. They told me they were treating it as unlawful occupancy and that charges were likely pending. Then came the thing that made me want someone to give me my bones back. A photograph. Evidence, it turned out, included a picture of me in my own bed, taken at 3:11 a.m. The timestamp stared back from the print like a name. I didn't remember feeling watched. I didn't remember the click of a shutter. I remembered only the sensation of being seen and then the basement silhouette. To see that image of myself, sleeping, unguarded, in my own home, with a man who had been living beneath me, was a violation of a kind I can't name, and it lodged in me like something lodged in a throat. Afterwards, there were the practicalities that people expect. A police report, the locksmith changing more locks, the neighbors' cautious looks. But the part that noisier steps couldn't fix was the way I moved through the house. I stopped going down to the basement at night. I turned on every light when I came home. I started sleeping with the door closed and my phone on my chest like an animal that might wake and warn me. Things that felt ordinary before had become the edges of a map I no longer recognized. The house, for a while, was a place I had to step into as if it were an unknown city. There are echoes that follow you through the day after nights like those. You flinch at noises. You jump at keys turning in locks. Your friends call you brave, and you smear the word with a laugh because bravery is complicated when it's mixed with exhaustion. You replay the small things and try to find a point where a line could have been drawn and the rest prevented. Sometimes you find it, sometimes you don't. I didn't. All I had were the accumulating facts, the unplugged charger, the footprints, the man curled on a mattress, the photograph with its merciless time. Across all three of these nights, the forest, Charleston, my house, there is the same cruel grammar. Tiny aberrations form sentences. Repeat occurrences become paragraphs. And the final chapter is always the same. A reality where the safe space you once took for granted has been redefined by someone else's presence. It could be a figure at the tree line waiting like a secret, a man in an immaculate suit who refuses to be explained, or the discovery that someone has been sleeping beneath your floorboards and holding a picture of you. The commonalities are not dramatic in the moment. They are small and slow and then suddenly massive. What made them worse wasn't always the danger itself. It was how each violation rewired me to expect being watched. The sound at the edge of sleep that could mean anything and therefore meant everything. Safety, I learned, is often a fragile arrangement between what we assume and what actually is. The stories don't get tidy endings. They settle in you as a faint static that sometimes grows louder and other times fades into the background. For me, those nights rewired routines and left a residue of mistrust in places that used to scaffold my life. I don't have answers for why these things happened. I can't tell you motive or intent, or whether any of the people I encountered meant me direct harm. In the woods, the man left without incident. In Charleston, the suit man never made a move beyond showing up in the wrong places. In my basement, the man taken away was quiet when the police arrived. What I can tell you is what it felt like to be the one in the story. The hollowness of being looked at and not understood. The trembling certainty that your world is now smaller and stranger. If one lesson threads through all of it, it's the way ordinary details become warnings. A knocked charger, a silhouette at a tree line, a bow tie that shouldn't be in a farmer's market. Those tiny things built into a pattern, and patterns are the only proof we really get. They don't always resolve neatly. Sometimes all they leave is an image. For me, the image that lingers most is the timestamp on the photograph. 3:11 a.m. and the bow tie catching rain under a streetlight as a man turned a corner and kept going. Those two pictures sometimes sit side by side in my head like a pair of postcards from places I thought I'd known. If one of these stories grabbed at you and refuses to let go, tell me which one in the comments. Which of the three unties you the most? The man at the tree line, the suit in the city, or the stranger in the basement? Subscribe if you want more true accounts. Share with someone who likes the slow burn of things that won't leave you alone. And if you have a story like this, a small, almost meaningless detail that turned into something that rearranged your life, I want to hear it. These nights changed me. They kept me awake and taught me to notice the little wrongnesses before they became larger. I wish I could promise they had a moral, a tidy ending, a place where everything made sense and the fear dissolved. I can't. What I can do is tell you, plainly, what happened to me, and leave you with that last image. A photograph stamped 3:11 a.m., a bow tie glittering in the rain, and the feeling that sometimes the world opens for someone you didn't expect to meet.